A 16-year-old girl's body was discovered brutally murdered in a roadside ditch on Chambers Road in Walton, Kentucky in June 1976. The Kentucky State Police was dispatched right away. A team of investigators from the Walton State Police Department arrived on the scene at approximately 7:15 a.m. Though there were several wounds and bruises on the victim's body, the head wound was the most severe. Deep strangling marks surrounding the neck were also found by the investigators. As they investigated the crime scene, they found flattened grass and shattered twigs. The body had obviously been dragged here. Also, the crime scene did not have any bloodstains. The investigators concluded that the crime took place at some other location. This was simply a dumping ground. The body was left in the open, as if the perpetrator wanted it discovered, with no attempt made to conceal it. Despite searching the area, investigators were unable to locate any clues, fingerprints, or the weapon used to commit the crime. The investigators had no leads to pursue, because there were no witnesses or hard copies of any evidence. After the crime scene investigation produced no results, detectives looked into the victim's body for information. Her body was taken to the lab of the county medical examiner to be autopsied. She had been the victim of a brutal assault, according to the postmortem results. A tire iron was used as a weapon with considerable force. The victim's face, severely bruised and swollen, was almost unrecognizable. There was a noticeable severe laceration on her skull. There were obvious indicators of severe physical trauma and genital abuse. The cause of the death was identified as manual strangulation, asphyxia, and blunt force injuries to the head. Just when there was no more hope, the forensic team achieved a breakthrough. After examining the victim's clothing, they found foreign DNA. However, when they ran the DNA sample through the central database, no match was detected. The case file became cold and began to gather dust as there were no new leads. The girl, who was only 16 years old, met such a cruel end to her life. She was identified as Carol Sue Klaber. Born and bred in Boone County, Kentucky, Carol Sue Klaber entered the world in 1960. As a senior, she went to Dixie Heights High School. Carol Sue was well known for her love of music, in addition to being an excellent student. She played the piano and violin. She was quite active in the school band, which developed into a big aspect of her life. Carol was not merely a musician and a student. She was a devoted sister as well. Her brothers, Charles and Thomas Klaber, were quite close to her. Carol Sue's father died of heart failure when she was just 10 years old. In a little town, Carol Sue led a fairly normal life. However, Carol Sue's regular trips to Devu Park in western Covington, Kentucky, were what really set her apart. Devu Park served as her haven, her go-to spot for relaxation, and her social center during a time when face-to-face encounters were the only means of communication. She loved riding her bike and having heart-to-heart talks with friends here. Carol was well liked by her acquaintances that she met at Devu Park because of her gregarious and charming personality. On June 4th, she rode her bike to the park at about 5:30 p.m. The plan was to go to Z's Hyde Park restaurant for dinner with friends. At the park, however, witnesses saw her conversing with a stranger rather than hanging out with her pals. He stood at around 5 feet 10 inches tall, with a thin body and shoulder-length sandy blonde hair. He either drove a Chevy Monte Carlo or a phenomenal Pontiac Grand Prix. They both left the park together. She was observed loading her bicycle into the man's vehicle's trunk. After that, the man drove her home, where her neighbors witnessed her unloading the bicycle from the vehicle. She entered, but the car did not drive off right away. It stood there idling in the driveway. Carol Sue returned a little while later, changed into her new clothing, and took off with the same man. This was her last known sighting. When Carol Sue's family reported her missing, authorities informed them of a body found that bore a striking similarity to Carol Sue. Thomas, her brother, fearlessly entered the morgue to verify the unthinkable truth. It was indeed Carol Sue. Days became years. and the Carol Sue case remained unresolved until it finally went cold. Her family and friends can only hope for the answers and resolution that have remained painfully elusive with every second that goes by. After years of silence, a glimmer of hope appeared regarding Carol Sue's case. Coy Cox and Tina Adams, two cold investigators, revisited the investigation in 2017. They collaborated with the original detective Jerry Keith, who was an authority on the Carol Sue case but is now retired. Together, the three of them went through the case file page by page, searching for information from an entirely different angle. Cox and Adams started their search by going over two suspects that Keith had already pointed out. The initial lead was a man who fit Carol's last ever seen car's description and had a history of auto theft. They located him and asked him some questions. The individual was surprisingly cooperative considering his criminal record. He did not cower behind a legal team, but he firmly denied any involvement in Carol's murder. He was aware that his past transgressions put him under suspicion, but he steadfastly maintained his innocence in Carol's murder. Adams and Cox requested a DNA test, and he voluntarily supplied a sample. The long wait was over, and the results were released in December 2018. His DNA did not match the foreign material discovered on the girl's clothing. He wasn't the one who did it. In 2020, after eliminating their first suspect, Cox and Adam turned their attention to the second suspect. Their focus narrowed on an unidentified attacker who had carried out a similar crime in the same area on October 1, 1978, a mere 2 years after Carol's body was found. The only difference was that the victim is still alive. The victim of the crime on October 1, 1978, was contacted by the detectives. She described the terrifying incident of that fateful evening. It was a dark and quiet evening in Park Hills, Kentucky, when she was ambushed in her garage. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a man grabbed her from behind. What happened next was a horrific experience that lasted for 2 excruciating hours. She was subjected to torture and brutal assault. After having his way with her for a while, the assailant struck her repeatedly and burned her with a cigarette to keep her in check. Cox painstakingly went over the records, piecing the evidence together. His search was fruitful when he found a crucial fingerprint on the victim's vehicle. To their amazement, they discovered a match when they ran the fingerprints through their system. Michael Dean Tate turned out to be the perpetrator. He was 77 years old at the moment. Michael Dean Tate was detained after it was discovered that he had assaulted a lady in a similar manner in 1978. Moreover, as a possible suspect in the Carol Sue case, Cox and Adams were now on his tail. Tate spent the 1970s and 1980s traveling to Kentucky on a regular basis for employment. Despite his dubious background, he too vehemently denied any role in the murder. Investigators are certain that they have identified the culprit at last. However, their hope was dashed when it was discovered that Carol's DNA did not match Tate's. Moreover, court documents definitively identified Tate as being in Cincinnati in 1976, which put the investigators back at the beginning. They were still unable to solve this decades-old riddle. Detectives Cox and Adams turned to Othram Labs, a private organization with a special talent for solving the seemingly intractable, for assistance in September 2022. Even with somewhat distant ties, Othram Laboratories is able to assist law enforcement in determining a person's relative identity. This is accomplished by means of specialized DNA testing that examines single nucleotide polymorphisms, which are minuscule variations in DNA, and short tandem repeats, which resemble microscopic patterns in DNA. The authorities can use DNA testing to identify potential family members of the attacker. In September 2022, Othram Laboratories was assigned this duty. It took less than 2 months after finance was secured. The findings were returned by Othram Laboratories by November 2022. Based on the DNA samples that the offender left behind, a genetic connection was found. Thomas Dunaway was the man. But there was a catch. Thomas Dunaway had already died in 1990. This implies that his DNA could not be directly matched by the police. Nevertheless, he had a son who grew up unaware of his father. This finding would turn out to be the key to solving the puzzle. To gather DNA samples for comparison, detectives made the trip to see Mr. Dunaway's biological son. The lab yielded an astounding result when comparing the DNA of Dunaway's son with foreign DNA discovered on Carol Sue's clothing 46 years ago. Carol Sue Klaber and her family would eventually receive justice in December 2022, nearly 46 years after the atrocity. There was no doubt in their minds that the individual they were searching for was Thomas W. Dunaway, thanks to the DNA results. When Thomas W. Dunaway took Carol Sue's life, he was just 19 years old. He was able to avoid prosecution for several years, but the cops' unceasing pursuit of him finally caught up with him. Detectives could look into his former life and the crimes he committed now that they had a name. Further evidence indicating his proximity to Devou Park was discovered. This is the location where Carol Sue and a man who looked like Dunaway were last spotted. They discovered more damning evidence as they dug further. Thomas W. Dunaway committed multiple offenses over his life. At one point, he proceeded on a 6-month criminal rampage, during which he abandoned the cars he drove. Even after Carol Sue Klaber died, he continued to commit crimes. Not even 6 months after Carol Sue's tragic passing, he was found guilty of killing someone else in Boone County. Ronald Townsend, then 19 years old, was discovered shot and bleeding on the ground on a December night in 1976. He was sent to the hospital after suffering serious injuries. He passed away from his wounds 4 days later, leaving his family in mourning. There was a pattern to Dunaway's crimes. He would leave his cars behind as he fled the area. Detectives found him because of his passion for automobiles. In May 1976, Dunaway purchased a two-tone 1973 Chevrolet Monte Carlo. He picked Carol Sue up at the park in the same vehicle. Following the murder of Carol Sue, he traded it in for an orange Chevrolet Vega. He fled Kentucky's Union and sought safety in Fort Carson. He was able to distance himself from Carol Sue's case thanks to his car swapping. It was the orange Vega he was driving, though, that he shot Ronald Townsend in. Many witnesses saw the orange Vega that the shooter drove off in, but no one saw who the perpetrator was. The investigator made an effort to find his highly noticeable orange Vega. After a chase that ended with his arrest in South Carolina on Christmas Eve 1976, he was charged with arson of another person's vehicle and illegal handgun possession. He entered a plea of guilty and was given a life sentence. Sadly, Dunaway's sentence was shortened, and he was freed early from prison in 1984 after just 7.5 years of incarceration. There were unsettling parallels between Ronald Townsend's and Carol Sue's horrific murders. It almost seemed like a jab at the authorities that both victims were abandoned in full view next to the road. The attacker appeared to be trying to convey a message. While many spotted his ostentatious automobile, no one saw the real culprit in any case. A more thorough inquiry showed that the United States Army was not the only organization hunting for Dunaway. He was also of interest to the Army. It's interesting to note that Dunaway joined the Army 9 days after killing Carol Sue. After serving in Fort Knox at first, he was moved to Fort Carson in Colorado. After killing Townsend, Thomas Dunaway left the Army after just 6 months of service and went insane. It's still unclear how Carol Sue Klaber and Thomas Dunaway are related. Detectives had nothing except theories. There was no hard proof of how the two of them knew one another. Given that they both attended the same schools in the Erlanger-Ellesmere schools area, it was possible that they were childhood friends or classmates. However, if that had been the case, Dunaway would have been recognized at the park by someone. Detective Cox thinks Devou Park may have a key clue. Given Carol's reputation for being outgoing, it's plausible that she initially saw Dunaway there on that night, which might have marked the beginning of their dating relationship. If Dunaway had still been alive, investigators would have been able to charge him with Carol Sue's execution based on the solid DNA evidence they had against him. However, Detective Cox managed to secure a court order to uncover Dunaway's 1990 burial. This made it possible to obtain a direct DNA sample for the Carol Sue case, but more significantly, it will be added to the combined DNA index system, which may allow his DNA to be connected to other unresolved murders. Even while the case may not have ended with justice done, Dunaway's identity was made public, which provided some closure. Given Dunaway's past, his criminal activity, and his 1984 release from jail, there are legitimate questions over the actual degree of justice rendered. Even while there is some resolution, it highlights how intricate the criminal justice system is. The remains of an unnamed woman was discovered in a state park in 1979. For several years, her case remained unresolved. It wasn't until 2023 that key breakthroughs, including as advances in forensic technology and cross-state collaboration, provided new light on the long-running mystery, and the culprit was apprehended. On September 28, 1979, at the Sugar Pine Point State Park campground on Lake Tahoe, a woman's body was found. She seemed to have been strangled and had severe bruises and beatings. She looked to be in her early 30s and was wearing jewelry. She was wearing a deer pendant, a wristwatch, and various rings. The three individuals who found her dead body did not contact the police right away. Rather, they made a call to a nearby newspaper and disappeared. After that, the reporter notified the law enforcement. Police discovered that the three men had not reported their discovery because they had warrants out for arrest. For this particular offense, however, they were all cleared. It was alarming to learn from the autopsy that Jane Doe was probably still alive when she was found. Her body was subjected to a SA kit test, as it seemed like she had been abused. To gather evidence, these kits include sterile containers, combs, microscopic slides, and collection bags. With the aid of these kits, hairs, saliva, blood, and other bodily fluids are collected off the victim's body in order to provide proof of the assault and identify the perpetrator. It was discovered that she had taken serious hits to her body, and there were defensive wounds that showed she had retaliated. Around the picnic area on the western side of the lake, there were several indications of fighting, and the victim misplaced one of her flip-flops in her attempt to flee from her attacker. Little evidence was collected by the investigating cops, but they did inadvertently seize one crucial object, an empty beer bottle they discovered next to the deceased. Forensic technology was not as developed in 1979 as it is now. The body was kept in the morgue for a long period, and the evidence was filed away. The decision was made to bury the unidentified woman in an unmarked grave in a potter's field in El Dorado County, since no one came forward to claim her. As it was then, Lake Tahoe has always been a well-liked vacation spot. People from all over the world constantly flock to the beaches and campsites. Thus, it was difficult to find this woman because she can be from anywhere. It was unknown at the time who she was and how she got there because the police did not find a car or additional belongings. The case was deemed unresponsive due to technological limitations and was therefore taken off the priority. Years later, in 1986, with the advent of DNA testing, the DNA extracted from the beer bottle and the victim was tested. Decades later, no more progress was made, despite the fact that it was evident the attacker owned the bottle. Investigating Officer John Gaines took over this case in 2014, about 36 years after it was first started. He reopened Jane Doe's files from Lake Tahoe. It was part of El Dorado County's cold case unit, investigating cases from the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. He excavated the body in the Lake Tahoe Jane Doe case with the help of a forensic anthropologist from California State University, Chico. To help identify her, he printed images of her jewelry that would be made public. Local publications ran the photos, but there were few leads. Upon noticing the necklace, Gaines came to the realization that the deer necklace was actually a high pendant, symbolizing the Jewish life emblem. It was the kind of pendant that Elvis Presley wore on stage, he explained. Gaines tried his luck with the local Jewish community, using a high pendant as a lead. Local Rabbi Mordei Richler, who had been opened a Chabad in Lake Tahoe, was taken aback when police contacted him. One does not frequently see police and the center's representatives at a Chabad, which is regarded as a Jewish community center. It is a sacred location of tranquility and purity. After hearing the details of the situation, Rabbi Richler was eager to assist and inform the neighborhood. When the body was found in 1979, there were not many Jewish families living in the Lake Tahoe region at the time. The area now have 2 synagogues and over 1,000 Jewish residents. In September 2015, 3 investigators wearing plain clothes but carrying firearms and badges paid Rabbi Yossi Grossbaum a visit. Gaines arrived in Folsom, California, hoping to make contact with the victims' living relatives. Rabbi Grossbaum spread information throughout the state and in Northern California. Eventually, a family identified the pendant in the press and stepped forward. The proclaimed victim's daughter and the remains underwent a DNA test, and the results showed a match. The body was subsequently positively identified as Patricia Carnahan, an individual who would have been 35 years old at the time of her demise. Patricia, who was originally from Virginia, had left on a solitary road trip through California. She was driving a red Volkswagen bus. She never made it home, despite having called her family to let them know she was on her way. The Spokane Police Department was one of the few that had officers assigned to work full-time on abuse probe test cases. Out of the more than 1,500 kits that the SPD had, over 250 kits had matches on the Combine DNA Index system. This resulted in an enormous discovery. A man in Spokane was charged in 1994 of having his way with a homeless woman. She was tested to confirm her allegation, reported the assault to the police, and named Harold Carpenter as the person who had attacked her. He was charged with coercing her against her will in the second degree, but the woman chose not to pursue legal action. Therefore, the case was dropped. Harold Carpenter asserted that their relationship was consensual and that he did not violate her. Therefore, it was just his word against hers. The test kit was uploaded into CODIS after being filed away. The woman who filed the lawsuit had died a long time ago. However, Patricia Carnahan's body and the empty beer bottle DNA matched the system's DNA. After more research, Carpenter was found to have been present in the vicinity of the crime scene when he was arrested for driving under the influence on September 29, 1979, in Susanville, California. Between 1990 and 1993, Carpenter was arrested for a number of misdemeanor offenses. In 1994, he was charged with another non-consensual event with a lady. He was married and resided in Sandpoint until his divorce in 1998, when she filed domestic assault charges against him. In Bonner County, he was charged with possession of illegal narcotics, reckless driving, multiple DUIs, and disturbing the peace between 1998 and 2018. Except for a DUI in 2000, his record in Washington was quite clean. Since 2016, Carpenter has been homeless. and has been residing on Spokane Street. He was detained in 2018 on suspicion of involvement in another non-consensual case in Spokane County, but the allegations were unfounded. He was mentioned in a story about his homelessness that appeared in the Inlander in 2020. You just tough it. You just go outside and you try to get out of the rain or the snow or whatever. He was under suspicion for an alleged groping incident in 2022, but once more, no arrest was made. He relocated to the Park Tower Apartments in Spokane's downtown. El Dorado County investigators now had a good reason to take him into custody, and the Spokane Police Department assisted in locating him. The 63-year-old was apprehended on March 1, 2023, for the murder of Patricia Carnahan, and he was brought to justice as a result of the cooperation of multiple governmental authorities. The Spokane case was not pursued because of the statute of limitations, and no charges were brought against him in that specific case. He is being held in Spokane County Jail, without bond, while he waits to be extradited to El Dorado so that he can face charges for his actions. The long-running cold case was eventually solved. Thanks to forensic technology advancements and cross-state agency cooperation, Patricia Carnahan's attacker was identified 44 years later. The mystery of the Lake Tahoe Jane Doe of 1979 has been solved nearly half a century later. Surrounding an abandoned warehouse in Oporino, south of Vigo, and close to the Portuguese border, workers by chance found human remains in a sealed well in February 2021. The body had decayed severely and undergone a process called saponification, in which bacteria that thrive in a warm, moist environment convert body fat into a material that resembles waxy soap, rendering the body entirely unrecognizable. The unidentified individual had suffered multiple severe blows to his body in addition to a fatal strike to his head, concluded by the investigators. However, his identity remained a mystery due to his lack of flesh and the absence of any personal belongings in the well. The results of the DNA test showed no match with any missing or known person in police databases. The Guardia Civil Police Force went to Fernando Cerula, a forensic scientist from the Galicia Institute of Legal Medicine, in 2022, when the inquiry had come to a standstill. In forensic facial reconstruction, a face is recreated using skeletal remains and a combination of anthropology, anatomy, and creative interpretation. Dr. Cerula created 6 renditions of the man's face with the assistance of artist Alba Sanin, each with a little variance in the man's hair color and quantity of facial hair. The image aligned with the stylistic perceptions. A Portuguese woman came forward a few weeks later, saying she had not seen her brother in over 3 years, and that she recognized him. After the woman's account was verified by DNA testing, the guy who had been missing for 20 years was found to be Carlos Alberto Videira do Orfao, a Portuguese native who had been operating a used car dealership in Vigo. Civil detectives with the Guardia were able to determine that 37-year-old Carlo vanished on October 13, 2018. Following his travels until his death, the investigators found 5 people who they think had varying degrees of participation in the slaying. These people may have been connected to Carlos's past scams and his transactions involving used automobiles. The investigating magistrate in Oporino has remanded 2 of the accused men in custody and freed on bail the 3rd man who was allegedly involved. Working in Darwin Cemetery in the Falklands, where the International Committee of the Red Cross has spearheaded an attempt to put names to over 120 anonymous Argentinian troops, Dr. Cerula has established a reputation for identifying dead in advanced states of decomposition. He also contributed to the identification of the Madrid train bombing victims in 2004. He also gave a face to Manuel Blanco Romasanta, the first serial killer in Spanish history, who killed 13 people in the 19th century, claiming he was converted into a wolf by a curse. Regarding the men suspected of killing Carlos Alberto Videira do Orfao, there has been no public update. If you find this video compelling, show your support by giving it a thumbs up subscribing to our channel, and ringing that notification bell. By doing so, you'll stay updated about the latest investigations and mysteries. Your support means the world to us as we continue to pursue the truth in the world of unsolved cases.